Evening all, Daniel Hand, RPG therapist, and we're going to follow on from last week's video by taking a look at what you might call the life cycle of an RPG, which is to say all of the jobs you have to do whilst playing the game, setting it up, and generally what it might look like to a third-party observer. Now, as I touched on in last week's video, this can actually be a fairly long-winded topic. Nothing overly complex, but a lot to cover. And with this in mind, I'm actually going to split this conversation into two. This week we're going to have a look at all the prep that you need to do before you can actually sit down and get the game to the table. Next week we'll have a look at the jobs, the admin, all of the things you've got to do to keep the game running and for everybody to enjoy the experience. Please bear in mind that I'm going to be a bit melodramatic here. This is all worst case scenario, but I hope it'll serve to illustrate why the job of applying RPGs to the therapeutic process has historically been less than straightforward. Once we've got all of this out of the way, I'll do another video looking at how we can take all of this stuff and simplify it into something that we as therapists can use with our clients. So stay tuned. First item on the agenda when it comes to RPGs is deciding what game you actually want to play. Sounds simple, I know, but there are so many games out there that you can very easily succumb to decision paralysis. You want to play fantasy? Great. But what kind of fantasy do you want to play? Your bog standard Dungeons/Dragons? A magical riff on Far Eastern history? Swashbuckling pirate action with giant sea monsters and cursed treasure? Or maybe you want to play sci-fi. Awesome. What's your fancy? Space western? Wars amongst the stars? Small town kids on bikes uncovering weird alien tech? You've got cosmic horror, modern warfare, superhero action, television tie-ins, slapstick comedy, on and on it goes. And that's just the genre. Then you've got to decide what exact rule set you want to use. Do you want crunchy, skill-based systems with lots of dice rolling and rules? A hand-wavy narrative game which puts more emphasis on the roleplay than the dice? A war game? A board game? A journaling game? A drinking... No, not that one. Do you want a game that uses miniatures, standees and model terrain? Or one that encourages theatre of the mind? This is the reason my friends and I quietly, or screamingly, despair whenever a new awesome looking game comes out, because it's another one to add to the "we really need to give that a try one day" list. Put it to you this way, The One Ring is easily my favourite RPG in existence, but I haven't played it in years because there's so much else we need to try. Eventually though, you have to settle on something, and when that happens, it's time for you to move on to the next step, finding a group of people to play the game with you. The more obscure the game, the harder this will be, obviously, and if you have a regular group of players already, it shouldn't be too much of a problem, although of course in that case you've got to find a game that all of you wants to play. Of course, finding a group these days isn't nearly as difficult as it used to be, thanks to the advent of online play, but it's still an issue. And as I mentioned in my last video, there are just so many games out there that you'll get a few blank looks when you first ask, "Hey, anybody fancy playing some Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades?" The magic number with the vast majority of RPGs tend to be 4 or 5 players, with one GM or Game Master, more on that in the next video, and 3 or 4 players. Once you've got enough interested individuals, the next trick, the most magical accomplishment of any RPG group, is to figure out a time when you're all available. To get anything out of a session, you're probably looking at least a 2-hour slot. 3 is more likely if you want to get everybody involved and having a good time, and if you want to play through a complete scenario rather than just a single conversation. Now, when you're a university student and your biggest concern is how drunk you're going to get tonight, finding time for all of this can be fairly straightforward. But as soon as you've got relationships, careers, children, and life, all of a sudden getting 4 or 5 people together in the same place for 3 hours can be an act of organisation worthy of Marlborough, Wellington and Slim combined. So, you've got a game, you've got your players, and you've got a session. You're good to go, right? Right? You poor naive soul. No, now comes the really hard work, getting these new players of yours to learn the rules. And remember what we said last time about how intimidatingly dense this can be? Yeah, that. Somehow you need to convince this disparate bunch of people, some of whom you may never have met before, to familiarise themselves with page after page of rules, mechanics, descriptions, choices, and inspirational material. Which is a big ask in and of itself, but don't forget, if you want optimal results, this means each of them buying their own copy of at least the game's core rulebook, and these are usually £40 or $50 a pop. In reality, you're very unlikely to get everybody in the group to have read all of the rules before you start playing. Hell, with some of them you'll be lucky if they've learned the rules by the time you've finished playing. And odds are the first few sessions of play will involve a lot of checking and rechecking mechanics, especially if the book is appallingly laid out so that nothing is where you expect it to be. Which in turn means spending a lot of time outside of the game itself. So the more work everybody does before you start playing, the better the gaming experience will be. They'll also need to have at least a rough idea of this particular game's method of creating characters, which again we'll look at next time. While this is happening and the players are busy not reading the rules, the game master has their own epic task to complete. On top of being extra specially familiar with the rules, because all the other players are just going to assume that the person who chose the game must already be familiar with every word of the 300-page book, they have to put together an adventure for the game and for the players to follow. This can take 2 routes. You've got creating everything yourself, from the world to the characters to the storyline, and this can involve things like drawing maps of the story world, designing special abilities or homebrewing rules. Or you can pick up a pre-written adventure, but then you've got to familiarise yourself with it. Because, okay, yeah, that second option's easier, but it can also lead to problems of its own, like not being able to find a certain piece of information, and again, therefore having to spend time with the game on pause. Of course, if you designed everything yourself, you wouldn't have that problem, but you know, that means you've got to design everything yourself. Pros and cons both ways. Either way, time and brain space are required. How much of each will obviously depend on the scale of the adventure and the story. A one-shot, 3-room dungeon, for example, will be far easier to design or learn than a world-spanning year-long campaign. But it's still another job that needs doing before anybody can get anything out of the game proper. And only now, after all that preparation, are you ready to get your group together and actually start the process of playing the game. Which, obviously, is a whole other job in and of itself. But that can wait till next week. So, what are your thoughts? Does that sound like a lot? I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that RPGs do require a lot of prep before you can even start playing. And that has really detrimental effects on RPGs' viability as a therapeutic intervention. Having to do all of this with every single client. I mean, can you imagine how overwhelming that would be? But just to labour the point, this is not an insurmountable problem, and we're going to spend plenty of time in future videos looking at how all of this can be made to work. Just bear with me. Before we get to that though, we're going to look at the execution part of playing an RPG. You know, what happens when you and your group finally get to the table. So I hope you'll join me for that chat, and we can have more fun exploring this topic. My book, Role-playing games and psychotherapy, a practitioner's guide, is available wherever you get your reading material. If you're interested in becoming an RPG therapist, that's a great place to start, link below. You can also sign up for my monthly-ish RPG therapy newsletter, Handwriting, again, link below. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, either with thoughts on the channel, with a view to getting some RPG therapy training, or even if you're a prospective client looking to start therapy, you can find me at my website, monomythcounselling.co.uk. I'd love to hear from you. So, until next time, take it easy, don't do anything I wouldn't do, and have a good one. Cheers.